In this last session of the compassion retreat for the first day here, this last session titled Dealing with Anger. So this is one of the obstacles to compassion practice. In particular, it's related to compassion itself. And so we'll be looking at how to deal with anger in this session. So let's have a look at what we'll be covering in the session. We'll begin with a meditation. So we'll continue the compassion practice that we started in the last session. Again, a short review of some of the earlier topics. Then we'll look at anger, what it is and how to go about, how to deal with it. Look at the actual practice of dealing, some methods to deal with anger, do a guided meditation on that. After the meditation, like attachment, dispelling some misconceptions regarding anger. And then we'll look at this topic of cognitive fusion that I think can be quite helpful in helping us to begin to cultivate compassion for difficult people. And then finish again with question answer. So let's begin with the meditation, the compassion meditation. So we'll continue where we left off in the last session. So if you'd like to find a nice, comfortable posture, let's begin. Keeping the back nice and straight. And at the same time, allowing the entire body to become completely relaxed. Using the out-breath to relax and release any tightness or tension in any part of the body. And relaxing more deeply with each out-breath. And with each out-breath, letting go of any thoughts that may have arisen. Simply releasing them. And allowing the mind to come to rest in the present moment. Resting in that stillness. And as we did earlier, we can begin by cultivating compassion for ourselves and then expanding out to others. And we begin by imagining the inner purity of our mind as a small white radiant sphere of light in the center of our chest at the level of our heart. And then arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if I were free of suffering and its causes. May I be free of all suffering and its causes. May I be free of all mental afflictions. And then bring to mind one mental affliction that really causes you a lot of suffering. One mental affliction that you'd really like to eliminate. Maybe it's attachment, maybe jealousy, anger, anxiety, and so on. And imagine this mental affliction in the form of black smoke filling your body. And then with each in-breath, imagine drawing that black smoke into the sphere of light at your heart, completely dissolving it there. So with each in-breath, breathe in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing this mental affliction at your heart, dissolving it into the inner purity of your mind, your inner wisdom. Imagine the black cloud is now completely extinguished, and now you're completely free of that mental affliction. And simply rest in that freedom, rest in that purity of mind. And then allow your field of compassion to expand out to others. And allow your mind to move around. And whoever comes to mind, whether it's a friend, a stranger, or even a difficult person, attend to them. May you be free of all suffering and its causes. May you be free of all mental afflictions. And breathing in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing their suffering at your heart. And imagine the black cloud is now completely extinguished. And now they're completely free of suffering and its causes, free of all mental afflictions. And take delight in this. And allow your mind to continue to move around. Whoever comes to mind, whether it's an individual or even a group of people, attend to them. Breathing in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing their suffering at your heart. No matter how much darkness is drawn in, it is all extinguished without a trace, allowing the mind to continue to move around, breathing in with compassion. And then release all appearances and allow the mind to come to rest, resting in the inner purity of mind, which is in the nature of compassion. We can bring the meditation to a close. The foundation of the compassion wing of practice are these four immeasurables practices. In the Theravada Buddhist traditions, they're often called the four Brahma Viharas. And so far, we've looked at the loving kindness practice, Maitri in Sanskrit and Metta in Pali, the wish for ourselves and others to have happiness and its causes. And in the last session, we looked at compassion, or Karuna in Sanskrit and Pali, the wish for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes. And so we saw with the compassion, similar to loving kindness, if we really want to cultivate this compassion, then we really need to know what is suffering, what are the causes of suffering, how do we eliminate those causes. And here, when we talk about suffering, we're not just talking about unpleasant, painful physical and mental experiences. That at a deeper level, we're also including the craving and attachment to pleasant experiences. And then we talk about, at the deepest level, this all-pervasive suffering, meaning that the potential for suffering to arise in our life. So at the deepest level, compassion is really this wish to be free of this unsatisfactory state we find ourselves in, that there's always a potential for suffering to arise in our life. Why is that potential there? It's because our mind is contaminated by the mental afflictions. And so this is actually the underlying causes of suffering, are these mental afflictions. And the three main mental afflictions are these three poisons of ignorance, attachment, and aversion. Here we saw that ignorance in the three poisons is our ignorance with respect to the nature of reality. It's our distorted view of reality. There are a number of different ways in which we distort reality. And we'll be looking at those in the following two retreats, the two Vipassana retreats. But at the deepest level, we saw that the ignorance with respect to reality is this grasping to independent me, independent objective world. And that this type of ignorance here, sometimes called elaborations, we can eliminate through the Vipassana practice of emptiness. And so we'll be looking at that in quite some detail in the second of the two Vipassana retreats. And it's this distorted view of reality, this ignorance, which leads to attachment to pleasant things, aversion to unpleasant things. All of the other mental afflictions come out of that, and that's driving our behavior and resulting in our current unsatisfactory state of suffering. And that process we'll be looking again at in much more detail in the Vipassana retreat. Stages of cultivation of compassion, as with loving kindness, we go through the stages of self, friend, stranger, difficult people, and then towards all living beings. So that brings us now to the main topic for this session, and that is anger and how to deal with it. Anger in Sanskrit is pratyaga, in Pali patiga. Anger, as with attachment, is a mental affliction. It's a klesha. Remember, kleshas are mental factors which cause the mind to become agitated or disturbed. And we can talk about many types of mental afflictions. In Buddhist psychology, when we get an extensive presentation of mental afflictions, we have the 26, that is 6 root and 20 secondary. When they're condensed, they can be condensed down to those 6 root mental afflictions, which can be further condensed into these 3 poisons of ignorance, attachment, and aversion. And here in these 3 poisons, aversion, often in the 3 poisons, instead of aversion listed, we have anger listed, because anger is a very strong type of aversion, is very harmful and destructive. And so that's why we're looking at anger here and how to deal with it. And anger, we see a somewhat similar definition to attachment in that it's a mental factor which sees its object as unattractive, whereas attachment saw the object as attractive. It exaggerates the object's unattractiveness, similar to attachment, exaggeration, and thus wishes to harm the object. And so what we see here with anger, as with attachment, is this factor of exaggeration or distortion. Now, anger, here we see in the way it's used in Buddhism, is this intention to harm. So is anger the same as simply having strong emotions towards negative behavior? And I think this points again, as with attachment, in how this word is used in Buddhism versus psychology. So we saw earlier that attachment in Buddhism and psychology, how that word is used is not the same. In psychology, we saw that there are actually healthy forms of attachment to cultivate, i.e. the strong bond between 2 people. So in Buddhism, this wouldn't be really attachment. Similarly here, anger is not really defined, I think, the same as in psychology and Buddhism. And this was really highlighted to me recently when I read a book from a psychologist, and he was talking about anger. And in the book, he basically said, you know, you Buddhists have got it completely wrong with anger. Because in Buddhism, we want to eliminate anger 100%. And he said, no, that's not correct. He said that, you know, with anger, it's not about eliminating anger. It's about having the right type of anger at the right time in the right amount. Because he said, otherwise, how would you deal with difficult situations like social injustice? And so it became very obvious to me how he was using the anger, he was using the word anger, or was very different than the Buddhist understanding of anger. So anger, again, here in Buddhist psychology, you know, often we equate anger with some very strong language and behavior. Whereas here, as with attachment, we're looking, anger is really the underlying mechanism and the underlying intention. And here, anger, inbuilt in that usage of the word in Buddhism, is this intention to harm. And so therefore, in terms of social injustice, if our intention is to help and we use very strong language and behavior, then that wouldn't be classified as anger. So again, it really is the underlying intention, whether it's to help or to harm. So where does anger come from? As with attachment, as with all mental afflictions, it really comes from the underlying distorted view of reality. In particular here, the object of our anger seems to be the source of our suffering, because we're having an unpleasant experience and the unpleasantness seems to be there in the object because it seems to be objective. And it seems to be that is really causing me my suffering. And so therefore we have this anger, this wish to harm the object. So how do we deal with anger? So similar process to with attachment. The first point is to have a clear understanding of anger. what it is and how it leads to suffering. Because if we don't, we may think anger could be useful in some occasions. We won't have the aspiration to eliminate it. And again, as with attachment, to really then cultivate the view of genuine happiness. Because again, as long as we feel as if the source of my happiness, source of my suffering is out there, then whenever we're faced with something unpleasant, then of course we're going to react with anger, because it seems like that is really causing me suffering. So if we can shift that to understand that it's not so much what happens to us, but how we respond to what happens to us that is the source of our suffering, then we can see these difficult situations not as problems, but as opportunities. And then again, as with attachment, what to do when anger is arising. So the first step is mindfulness. So again, if we haven't really cultivated our mindfulness through shamatha practice, then what will probably happen is anger will arise. Before we know it, it's taken control of our mind. And then there's not really much we can do to deal with anger. About the only thing we can do once anger has taken control of our mind is get out of that situation fast before we say and do something we're going to regret. So again, the key is to catch anger before it takes control of our mind, that little window of opportunity. And so with mindfulness, we can notice anger as it's first arising. We're still in control. Then we can simply watch the anger as it's arising, not identify with it, not get caught up in it. And again, if we can simply watch it, it has no power over us at all. Any mental affliction from its own side has no power to do anything to us. They only have power if we give them power. And we give mental afflictions power either by identifying with them and getting caught up in following them, or trying to fight with them and suppress them. Then they have a lot of power to harm us. So again, all we need to do is to step back and watch the anger, and we're free of it. And it will simply dissipate by itself. We don't need to fight it, suppress it, and get rid of it. In addition to simply watching the anger, then we can also, again, apply antidotes to the anger. And antidotes, again, is not about trying to suppress the anger. These antidotes really are about seeing the situation from a more healthy, accurate perspective, and then this anger will simply dissolve. And one classic antidote to anger is patience. And patience here in Buddhism is simply an undisturbed mind in the face of a difficult situation. So to simply remain in that undisturbed mind. Again, simply have that undisturbed mind rather than getting caught up with anger. And again, at the deeper level, emptiness. We can apply the wisdom of emptiness as an antidote to really see that the unattractiveness that really seems to be there in the object is something that we're creating in our mind. That just like beauty is in the eye of the beholder, the ugliness or the unattractiveness is in the eye of the beholder. And therefore, not to get caught up in anger with regard to that object or person. And then similarly, we can look for the me who's getting angry. Where is the me that's getting angry? And if we don't find this objective me that seems to be here, we can release that false grasping and therefore release any anger that's coming from that. And so we practice these methods in meditation, and then get familiar with them, and then we apply them in daily life as an effective way of dealing with anger. So let's do that practice now. Let's look at some of these ways of dealing with anger in meditation, so then later we can apply them in daily life. So if you'd like to find a nice, comfortable posture, let's begin. As always, we begin with preparing the body. So establishing a good, comfortable posture. So that we can basically forget about the body and it doesn't cause any problems during the meditation. Allowing the breathing to flow naturally and effortlessly. And preparing the mind, setting it into a state of ease and relaxation. Simply allowing it to come to rest in the present moment, resting in stillness. So let's now have a look at some ways of dealing with anger. So first think of a situation where you got angry or frustrated when something didn't work out the way you wanted it to. And try to picture the scene clearly. And then ask yourself, could I have done something about that situation? If we can do something to change a situation, then there's no need to get angry. We simply make the change. And if there's nothing we can do to change a situation, then what's the use in getting angry? It doesn't help. And now think of a situation where you got angry when someone else criticized you. And again, picture the scene clearly. And then ask yourself, was their criticism valid? If what they said was true, why get angry? Because actually they're giving us the chance to correct our faults and to improve ourselves. And if what they said was untrue, since they're completely mistaken, then we can simply ignore what they're saying. No need to get angry. And regardless of whether their criticism was valid or not, they are providing us the opportunity to cultivate the quality of patience. So, in fact, they're being very kind to us. And now think of a situation where you got angry in a conflict with another person. And again, picture the scene clearly. Now, instead of looking at the situation from your own perspective, assume the perspective of the other person and try to imagine how the situation would look to them. When we try to understand their viewpoint, we can see that they're just like us. They're just trying to be happy. And that due to their confusion and mental afflictions, they're just creating suffering for themselves and the people around them. And so, in this way, by distinguishing the person from their behavior, we can begin to cultivate compassion for them. And if their behavior is inappropriate, we can address that bad behavior without attacking the person. Now, think of a situation where you often get irritated or frustrated. And allow some irritation or frustration to arise. And now, instead of focusing on the situation, look directly at the irritation or frustration itself. Don't try to push it away. Just look at it. What is the nature of the irritation or frustration? Is it something solid and concrete, or does it change? If we look directly at the irritation or frustration itself in this way, does it have any power over us? Do we need to fight with it? Or does it simply start to dissolve? Now think of a person who makes you angry or irritated. And picture that person very clearly. And now mentally dissect this person and search for what exactly is it that makes you so angry or irritated. Is it something they say? If so, words are just sounds. So which particular sound is irritating or makes you angry? Or perhaps it's something that they do that makes you irritated or angry. If so, physical actions are just movements of the body. So which particular movement of the body is irritating or makes you angry? Or perhaps it's simply their appearance that makes you irritated or angry. If so, appearances are simply colors and shapes. So which particular color or shape is irritating or makes you angry? So when we look at this, investigate in this way, we see how it's our mind that creates the irritating person by interpreting the situation in a certain way. And then we apply labels such as annoying and irritating. We then go on to mistaking our concept of the person for the person themselves. We see them as inherently irritating. So in conclusion, recognize that by engaging in these reflections, repeatedly relating them to situations in our life, we can clear up a lot of anger and frustration. And we can develop a more healthy way of looking at things and make a strong determination to do so. And releasing all appearances, allowing the mind to come to rest. Resting in that inner purity of mind, which is free from anger, free from irritation, frustration. And we can bring the meditation to a close. So let's have a look at some common misconceptions regarding anger and try to dispel those. The first one, we generally we appreciate anger can be very destructive and it's something we need to eliminate. But there can be this misconception that, well, actually, I need anger to deal with difficult situations. If I don't have anger, how do I deal with difficult situations? So no one is debating the fact that anger is very forceful. But what we saw in the definition, and we know from our own experience, is that anger completely exaggerates and distorts. And particularly if we have very strong anger, we completely distort what we see. And therefore, we often overreact and respond in completely inappropriate ways. And so rather than resolving the issue, then anger often makes the situation worse through that overreacting and inappropriate reaction. And so here, then Buddhism would say that when we're faced with a difficult situation, then instead of getting angry, we should practice patience. But then when people hear that, they go, well, they think that, well, patience means just sit there and do nothing. So then the doubt is, well, if I practice patience, then people will simply walk all over me. They'll walk over the top of me, use me as a doormat. So patience is not a behavior, it's a mental attitude. So patience here is simply defined as an undisturbed mind in the face of a difficult situation. So when Buddhism recommends to practice patience, what Buddhism is saying is that when we're faced with difficult situations, remain calm. Because if we can remain calm, we can more clearly and better evaluate what the situation is and therefore have a better and more accurate way of responding to the situation rather than exaggerating, distorting, and overreacting. But sometimes the difficult situations call for a forceful response. But then how can we be forceful if we should not use anger? And the Buddhist answer is compassion. But another misconception often here is that actually people often feel that anger is a sign of strength and compassion is a sign of weakness. Actually, it's the exact opposite. Anger is a sign of weakness because it means that we have to try to dominate people in difficult situations. We can't deal with difficult situations without trying to dominate people. So that is a sign of weakness. And compassion is a sign of strength. So compassion, again, is not about sitting there smiling and saying nice things or so forth. Compassion is the wish for someone who's behaving badly to be free of suffering and its causes, which means if they're behaving badly, the compassionate thing to do is to help them to overcome that negative behavior. For example, if they're physically attacking us, then with compassion, we use physical force if necessary to restrain them. If we allow anger to arise, then we'll probably overreact, use excessive force, and then the situation might get further out of control. So therefore, compassion is really a sign of strength. And compassion, we can be very forceful in difficult situations. And then the last topic before we go to question answer is, why do we get angry with others who behave badly? And in the same instance, then why do we find it so difficult to have forgiveness and compassion for these people? And I think there's a simple answer to that. Now, if someone's behaving badly, someone's doing a bad action, the correct perspective is simply acknowledging and seeing there's a person doing a bad action. So that's the correct perspective. But often in that situation where someone's behaving badly, we tend to adopt a very different perspective. And our perspective often is, oh, there's a bad person, there's a horrible person, a nasty person, an evil person. And so what we've done there is we have fused the behavior to the person. And in psychology, this is called cognitive fusion. And this is a false, invalid perspective because there are two things here. There's a person and their behavior. It's not one thing. A person is not their behavior. So if we simply see there or think there's a bad person, we've done that cognitive fusion. And if we do that cognitive fusion, if we wrongly identify a person with their behavior, then we're in trouble. Because in any given situation, we've got two choices, accept or reject. And generally, if someone's behaving badly, we reject. But rejecting on the basis of cognitive fusion translates into rejecting the person, attacking the person, getting angry at the person. Because actually the thing we don't like is their behavior. But because we've fused the person to the behavior, we direct that rejection to the person himself instead of simply just the behavior. And therefore we attack the person, we get angry at the person. And if we understand that attacking a person, getting angry at a person is not helpful, then the only other option left is accept. But accept on the basis of cognitive fusion generally results in accepting their bad behavior because we've fused the person to the behavior. And so both of those, rejecting and attacking the person and accepting bad behavior, is not helpful. But they're basically the two options available to us if we do that cognitive fusion. And then on that basis, compassion becomes very difficult because trying to have compassion for a bad person feels like what we're saying is, oh, what you did is okay, I don't mind. Of course we should mind. But that's why we find it difficult, if not impossible, to have compassion for a bad person, because it seems like we're somehow accepting their bad behavior, we're condoning their bad behavior, and that's not appropriate. So that's why it becomes impossible, or very difficult at least, to have forgiveness or compassion for them. And then it's even worse than that, because if we do this cognitive fusion, we end up with a fixed, biased view of that person. They're a bad person, which means then it becomes very difficult to acknowledge any good things that they do, because bad people don't do good things. And if they happen to do a good action, we'll sort of brush it off and go, well, they didn't really mean to do that good action because they're simply a bad person. So we end up with a fixed, biased view of that person. So the simple solution to all of this, of course, is don't do cognitive fusion, because it's a false, invalid perspective. So simply adopt the correct perspective, and that is simply acknowledge there is a person engaging in a bad or harmful behavior. Then we can accept the person, i.e. have forgiveness and compassion for the person, and at the same time reject that negative behavior, not tolerate the negative behavior, and help that person to address their negative behavior. And so therefore, if we adopt the correct perspective, then compassion is much more easy, because we're not somehow, it doesn't feel like we're accepting their bad behavior. We're only having compassion for the person and not tolerating, not accepting the bad behavior. And then it's much easier to have a balanced view of that person. And also, then if we do that cognitive fusion leads to conflict. Because if we see someone who's engaging in harmful behavior as a bad person, well, that's the bad person. They're the bad ones. I'm a good person. Let's get rid of those bad people. So basically, cognitive fusion promotes this division, this conflict of us versus them. Us good people need to get rid of those bad people over there. Whereas if we don't do that cognitive fusion, then it's simply a person engaging in a bad behavior. And sometimes we engage in bad behavior as well. So then rather than conflict, it leads to cooperation, helping those who engage in bad behavior. And also we see the difference here in terms of judging and evaluating. So whenever we judge or blame or so forth, this is on the basis of cognitive fusion. So we judge people, bad person, and also then we blame people for that because of that cognitive fusion. So rather than judging, then we need to evaluate. So if we have a correct perspective and see there's simply a person engaging in a bad behavior, then we can evaluate their behavior. See, one of the problems here is now in the modern world, we often hear this term to be non-judgmental, which is good, but unfortunately, many of us are doing cognitive fusion. And so if we're doing cognitive fusion and then someone tells us to be non-judgmental, then what happens is we end up accepting their behavior because we're doing the cognitive fusion. So non-judgmental doesn't mean to not evaluate behavior and accept whatever they do. We must evaluate people's behavior, our own and others' behavior. So non-judgmental does not mean don't evaluate. Rather, the non-judgmental really means don't do cognitive fusion, don't judge at all, rather evaluate behavior. So have compassion for people, evaluate their behavior. If they're engaging in harmful behavior, then help that person to overcome that behavior. So therefore, if people are behaving in an unethical way, in a bad way, bad behavior, then if we can avoid this cognitive fusion, what you will find is rather than instinctively getting angry at them, you'll start to find that instinctively you'll start to have compassion for them and try to help them to overcome that negative behavior and certainly not tolerate that negative behavior. So that cognitive fusion is also something we do with ourselves, not just others. And this, I think, is one of the main reasons we have an epidemic of low self-esteem in our modern world. Is because in our modern world, there seems to be this obsessive focus on the negative. We see it in the media, we see it everywhere, and we do it with cognitive fusion. So therefore, if we do a bad action, then we tend to have this perspective, I'm a bad person. And then of course, we end up with this fixed biased view of ourselves. I'm just a horrible person, I'm a bad person. And then we end up with low self-esteem. Now, unfortunately, again, in the modern world, because of this epidemic of low self-esteem, there are a number of therapies to help us to overcome low self-esteem. But unfortunately, some of them are still stuck in cognitive fusion in terms of, for people with low self-esteem, encouraging them not to think of themselves as a bad person, but to think of themselves as a good person. In fact, you're a special person. So this is not the answer to low self-esteem. Because if we do cognitive fusion on the positive side and say, I'm a good person, I'm a wonderful person, then it's a danger that it becomes an ego trip. We just boost the ego thinking I'm really good, I'm special, I'm better than everyone else. Rather, the answer to low self-esteem is to simply stop doing cognitive fusion. That's the answer. As long as we're stuck in cognitive fusion, whether we identify with ourselves as a bad person or a good person, either we're going to have low self-esteem or we're going to have a lot of puffed up arrogance, thinking we're better than everyone else. So the answer to both of those is don't do cognitive fusion. Then we can feel good about ourselves and not tolerate our negative behavior and look at overcoming our negative behavior. And so this is also, we find in the modern world, also there seems to be this epidemic of guilt that comes together often with this low self-esteem. And guilt is another classic example of cognitive fusion. Because if we've done something harmful and we feel guilty, what are we focusing on? Bad me, bad me. So guilt is coming from cognitive fusion. And so guilt is coming from a false, invalid perspective. And all that guilt does is it paralyzes us and makes us feel bad. It's not even addressing negative behavior. So we never need to feel guilty about anything. So the way to overcome guilt is to stop doing cognitive fusion. Rather, if we've done something harmful, simply acknowledge, I have done this harmful behavior. That's the correct perspective. And therefore, we can still accept ourselves, still feel good about ourselves, have compassion for ourselves, not tolerate our negative behavior, and instead of feeling guilt, have regret for our negative behavior. So that's the difference between regret and guilt. Guilt is coming from an invalid perspective, whereas regret is coming from a healthy perspective. And regret is focusing on the negative behavior, and that will inspire us to help us to overcome that negative behavior. So that's some things about cognitive fusion and how cognitive fusion can really not only lead to a lot of anger, but a difficulty in compassion, but also in terms of guilt and low self-esteem and self-hatred and so forth. More to be said about cognitive fusion, but maybe later in the Vipassana retreat. So now we've got still some time for question answer. So if you have any questions about anything from this session, then ask away. No questions, anyone? We've got at least 10 minutes or so.
Hi, Glenn. I'm
Pamela, yes.
Thanks. It's all really helpful. I find this subject so interesting. I often feel strong emotions, negative emotions like irritation or contempt or impatience with people, but I wouldn't say it quite goes to anger in that there isn't usually an intention to want to harm them. I more often just want to get away from them. So I'm just wondering how you could adapt all of the teachings you've just given us to that more moderated kind of mental affliction.
Yeah. So with all the mental afflictions, to understand that whether it's irritation, frustration, or so forth, that they all of them are something we want to eliminate. They're not, then, you know, first step is to understand what they are, and the develop the aspiration, let's eliminate them, you know, and to understand that really they're all really coming from a distorted view of reality at the deepest level. And then the first step again is simply the mindfulness, is to notice them. Because if we can simply, whatever mental affliction it is, if we can simply observe it, we're free of it. We're free of it. It can't grab hold of us. It's only because we identify with and get caught up that we get harmed by any mental affliction, whether it's irritation, frustration, or whatever. So if we can simply observe it as it's arising, we're actually free of it. It can't really do anything to harm us. And then again, with all of these mental afflictions, then we can apply antidotes to them. And one of the, I mean, I've been just really looking at the sort of the wisdom side of practice for antidotes. And so what we can do with all of these is, you know, with all of these frustration, irritation, or whatever, is to really look at, well, where is the me here that's getting frustrated or irritated? Because the frustration, irritation comes from a grasping onto a independent me. And so if we can start to release that grasping, then often there's no basis for that to arise. So that's what I've been focusing on with attachment and anger, but also with a lot of these mental afflictions, particularly with respect to other people. If the situation involves other people, and this is something we'll cover a little bit more tomorrow, is that our focus is on me. How is this situation affecting me? And then we end up with this me perspective. And so often with these sorts of situations, with irritation, frustration, and so forth, another way, an antidote, is to shift our perspective. How is the other person seeing this situation? To have a broader perspective. And so that can often help to transform our aversion or anger or whatever into compassion, or our attachment into loving kindness. And that's something we'll look at a little bit more tomorrow. And I wanted to add one more thing, but now it slipped my mind. It's gone now. What was it? No, sorry, it's gone. It's gone.
No, that's helpful. The idea of
Yeah.
shifting perspective, which is easier when it's a less strong emotion in the first place. So
yeah. I mean, yeah. But again, I think the sort of the key to all of this is our ability to catch them early. Because if we don't catch them early as they're arising, once they've got control of our mind, there's very little we can do because we're caught in the grip of the mental affliction. And then it's very difficult to do anything apart from just really getting out of the situation and allowing the mind to settle down. So the key to all of this is really to improve our mindfulness, to be able to notice these things earlier. And one way we can help improve that in the beginning stages is to look in the body, because often these things, these mental afflictions, start to manifest as some sort of tension or change in breathing in the body. And so often we can notice that more easily than we notice the mental affliction arising. So you can, and of course, if you then go into the body and notice that there's some tension somewhere or the breathing is getting a bit coarse, that is a very non-conceptual space. And so that will help avoid getting caught up in those mental afflictions, because it's all our discursive mind that is really generating these mental afflictions. So if we can get out of that discursive mind into a non-conceptual space without, of course, just ignoring everything, then that can be also very helpful for any sort of mental afflictions, is just observe what's going on in the body. Because the reality is we're not very good at observing mental afflictions, because our strong habit is we get caught up in them. And so as a sort of a temporary measure in the beginning phases, if we can shift the focus into the body and notice what's going on in the body correlating to this mental affliction, then we can, it's much more easy then to not get caught up in it. So that can be also very helpful.
Great, thanks.
Sure. I think we've got time for at least one more question.
Yes, there's a question from Antonella in the chat.
Okay, and then Judy after that, I think. Okay.
Yeah, there was actually a raised hand before Judy. So Antonella's question is, like all emotions, anger arises from a form of distress. Can anger then be seen as a form of calling for attention or help?
Sorry, there's a question? What's the question?
So in her experience, anger, as most emotions, arise.
Is what? Sorry?
Anger, as most emotions, arises as a form of distress.
That anger is distressing?
It arises as a form of distress.
You're distressed and therefore you get angry?
So the question is, can anger be seen as a form of calling for attention or help?
Yeah. I mean, see, the thing is with a lot of these mental afflictions, what is being, particularly when we talk about emotions, what is the surface display manifesting may be something much deeper going on that is causing it to manifest in that way. So this and many other situations where whatever what is presenting itself in terms of anger or whatever, could be something underlying like seeking attention, it could be fear, it could be all sorts of things underneath that as well. So yes, there can be many reasons for why these mental afflictions are coming up. But at the deepest level, they're all really stemming from this distorted view of reality, this grasping onto an independent me and an independent objective world. And that's something that we'll look at in more detail in the Vipassana retreat. And then last question, I think Judy had a question, if you still have.
Yes. So what if the other person is doing the cognitive fusion?
Yeah.
And then the behavior does not get addressed. And also it works in reverse, that I want to work on my bad behavior with the aid of the person who I've wronged.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Most of us in the modern world do the cognitive fusion because that's the way we've been programmed to think and speak since we were very young. And there's a high likelihood that whoever you're interacting with might be doing cognitive fusion. However, if we don't do cognitive fusion in the way which we speak to them, and we're consistent with that, I think we can have a positive effect on that person. Because, if they've engaged in some sort of harmful behavior and we start saying, oh, you're a horrible person, you're a bad person, of course they're going to react to that. Whereas if we use language such as, do you realize that thing you did was quite harmful? Then that way of speaking is not so threatening, because we're not directing at the person directly, we're directing at their behavior. So it will be less threatening than using the cognitive fusion language. And then if we use that language, and if they're a little bit open, they may sense that underneath that language, we have a compassion there, that we're really wanting to help them. And so from our side, there's no guarantee that they won't react or they won't do cognitive fusion. But the best chance we've got of them responding in a better way is if we, from our side, don't do the cognitive fusion and use language that's correct way of the correct perspective, by addressing their behavior and not the person. And even better is if, there's 3 stages we can go there. We can say, you're a bad person. Of course, they'll react to that. And the next step is better, is say, you did a bad thing. That's better. That's not going to be as threatening. But even better, instead of saying you did a bad thing, just say, that is such a bad thing to do. You don't even mention, it's obvious it's them, but if you don't mention their name, there's even less chance that they'll do cognitive fusion. So if we can use that way of speaking, that's going to be most helpful. Is it going to guarantee that they don't react? Of course not, but that's the best chance we've got to help them, is to not do the cognitive fusion in the way we speak to them.
But who am I to judge that?
No, we don't judge, we evaluate.
But that they're hearing it like, who are you to say what's good and bad?
Well, again, we can't, people will respond in whatever way they're programmed. All we can do is use our wisdom and compassion to try to talk to them in the best possible way. We can't we don't know how they're going to reply, but at least from our side, using wisdom and compassion, we can try our best to help them. And if they're still caught up in some rage or anger, then wisdom may say, well, I'm not going to say anything to them now, because whatever I say is just going to be like throwing petrol on the fire. So the best thing I can do now is say nothing and wait till they calm down, and then later I can try to talk to them. So, I mean, there's no guarantee of anything, but as long as we use whatever wisdom we have and the most compassion we have, that's all we can do in any situation to help people. We can't do more than that. And of course, we'll make mistakes, and then we just learn from those mistakes, and then next time we try something different. That's all we can do. We just use wisdom and compassion, don't do cognitive fusion from our side, and then that's the best chance we've got of helping anyone. I mean, that we can't do more than that.
Thank you.
Okay. Let's leave it there. We've run out of time. So tomorrow then, the first session will finish with the two last of the four immeasurables, empathetic, joy, and equanimity. And then in the second session, we'll go to this exchanging self with others practice, following which we'll go into that Tonglen giving and taking practice. And then the last session tomorrow will be looking at how to bring these various compassion practices into daily life. So that's it for today. So hopefully you got something out of it, and look forward to seeing you same time tomorrow. So bye for now.